Benjamin Hoffman. S eyes flickered open to a vintage television playing him sleeping, its static whispering his name. The screen showed his own face, eyes closed, breathing slow. The glow of the tube casting a sickly light on the cracked wood of the empty cruise ship cabin. The air hung thick, unnaturally hot. No wind to stir the curtains, just the faint scent of burnt wood and dust. My bare feet pressed into the floor, but the familiar grit of sand like I stepped on a beach, pricked between my toes, impossible. No sand here, just the smooth, cold planks of the ship. As deck, the cat sat on the edge of the bed, massive Maine Coon with matted grey fur that clung to its ribs like old rags. Its eyes, pale and dull, reflected the television. I watched as it lowered its head, then lifted a paw to the wound on my leg. A shallow cut from the night before. The cat tongue flicked out, not to lick, but to snatch the tiny insects crawling from the wound. They scuttled into its mouth, black bodies dissolving as it chewed. I felt the vibration of its purr through the floor, a low, rhythmic thrum that matched the sound of the ship. Sold pipes groaning. The television static crackled, a high-pitched whine that made my teeth ache. The screen showed a miniature house in the attic, a tiny light blinking from the second-floor window. I'd found it earlier, a scale model of my childhood home. But it was impossible. The house I grew up in burned down in '98. The television's static whispered, "Benjamin," over and over, each syllable sharp as broken glass. The cat's purr intensified, the sound of a clock winding down. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, weighted down by something invisible. The cat's fur rippled as it turned its head, staring at me with those pale eyes. I could feel its breath, hot and damp, like a furnace exhaling. The insects were gone now, but the wound still throbbed. The sand was still in my shoes, but I couldn't. Look, the television's light cast long shadows on the wall, and for a second I thought I saw the reflection of a house burning. The cat's paw lifted again, this time to my shoulder. Its claws dug into my skin, and I felt the insects inside my wound, crawling toward the cat's mouth. The purr became a steady, ticking sound, the sound of the doomsday clock. The television static rose to a scream, and the light from the screen turned red, like blood. The television's static pulsed, a sickly green light reflecting in the cat's eyes. The image on the screen fractured, a rain of crimson streaks bleeding across the sleeping face of myself. The scent of burnt sugar thickened, a cloying sweetness that coated the back of my throat. It was a scent I knew, a phantom memory of the fire. The cat's fur, a patchwork of matted gray, seemed to shift, the patterns blurring into something almost familiar. A distorted echo, a scraping of glass against something cold and hard, resonated from the far end of the cabin. A pressure like a child's hand pressing against my sternum made it difficult to breathe. I tried to lift my hand to shield my eyes from the flickering screen, but a leaden weight held me down. The cat's purr deepened, a low guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate through the deck plates, a sound that wasn't comforting but something else entirely. The sand beneath my feet, a gritty, unsettling sensation, felt colder now, as if the heat wave had abruptly shifted, bringing a sudden chill. It wasn't sand, not exactly. It was finer, more granular, like crushed bone. The TV screen cleared momentarily, displaying a distorted reflection of the cabin. But the reflection wasn't quite right. The walls were subtly different, the angles skewed, and standing in the corner of the reflected room was a figure I didn't recognize. Tall, gaunt, with a face obscured by shadow. The reflection vanished as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the static once more. The scraping sound returned, louder this time, like glass grinding against marble. It was coming from the mirror. I forced my eyes to the silvered surface, expecting to see my own distorted reflection. Instead, I saw a room. Not the cabin I was in, but a lavishly decorated parlor, bathed in the same sickly green light. A woman sat in a velvet armchair, her face hidden by shadow, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge my presence, but I felt her gaze, a cold, piercing weight that settled deep within my bones. The scent of burnt sugar intensified, overwhelming, suffocating. The pressure on my chest increased, making it hard to draw breath. The cat's purr morphed into a rhythmic ticking, a relentless countdown. The sensation of the sand beneath my feet intensified, pressing upwards, a granular vice tightening around my ankles. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, a strangled gasp lost in the hiss of the static. The woman in the mirror slowly raised a hand, her fingers long and skeletal. As she did, I felt a searing pain in my throat, a constriction that stole the ability to speak. The reflection flickered, and for a moment I saw not my own face staring back, but the face of the woman in the parlor. Her eyes, hollow and black, met mine, and a single word echoed in my mind, not as sound, but as a chilling certainty. Gone. The television screen exploded in a shower of sparks, the static intensifying into a deafening roar. The cabin spun, the walls blurring into a vortex of sickly green light. The cat's fur shifted again, the patterns now undeniably faces distorted, screaming faces, each one contorted in silent agony. The scent of burnt sugar became unbearable, a physical assault on my senses. The sand beneath my feet solidified, trapping me in place, a prisoner in a shifting, decaying reality. The mirror shimmered, and the reflection of the parlor vanished, replaced by my own face. But it wasn't my face. The eyes were different, colder, more distant. The mouth was twisted into a cruel, unfamiliar smile. I reached up, touching my cheek, and felt a texture that wasn't my own, rough, dry, alien. The cat leaped from the bed, landing silently on the floor, its pale eyes fixed on me. It opened its mouth, and a sound escaped, not a purr, but a voice. My voice, Benjamin. It whispered, the sound a rasping echo of my own. You are mine now. The air thickened, a viscous humidity clinging to my skin. The television's static, a malevolent hum, seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the ship. A pattern began to emerge, a fractured mosaic of crimson streaks bleeding across the static, momentarily illuminating the curve of the ceiling. The cat, a hulking mass of matted gray, shifted on the bed, its fur rippling like disturbed water, the patterns within seeming to coalesce into fleeting, distorted faces. A sharp, brittle sound echoed from the far end of the cabin, like glass scraping against a cold stone floor. A pressure built in my chest, not crushing but insistent, a subtle weight that stole the air from my lungs. The crimson streaks intensified, momentarily resolving into a rain of blood, like droplets on the glass of the mirror. The cat's fur seemed to writhe, the patterns rearranging themselves into a chaotic dance of ink-like shadows. The scraping sound returned, a dry, insistent rasp that grated against my teeth. The pressure on my chest intensified, a leaden weight that pressed against my sternum, making each breath a conscious effort. Another cycle began. The crimson streaks returned, painting the mirror's surface with a macabre rain. The cat's fur shifted again, the patterns blurring into a chaotic swirl of wet ink on glass. The scraping sound echoed, a brittle, unsettling rasp. The pressure on my chest tightened, a heavy weight that constricted my breathing. The pattern repeated. Blood rain on glass, ink like fur, scraping pressure. Each iteration felt subtly different, the crimson streaks a shade darker, the fur a little more chaotic, the scraping a touch more insistent, the pressure a fraction heavier. My vision blurred, the edges of the cabin seeming to warp and distort. A metallic taste coated my tongue, a faint coppery tang that clung to the back of my throat again. The blood rain, the inky fur, the scraping, the pressure, the cabin seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, the air growing thick and suffocating. A low hum resonated through the deck plates, a vibration that seemed to originate not from the television, but from within the very structure of the ship. The cat's eyes, usually dull and vacant, seemed to glow with a faint, unsettling light, a bruised sky blue that pierced the gloom. One more time. The crimson rain, the shifting fur, the scraping, the pressure. A wave of dizziness washed over me, the cabin spinning, the world tilting on its axis. I felt a profound sense of loss, a hollow ache in my chest, as if something vital had been stolen from me. The sound of glass shattering, a sharp, brittle crack, resonated through the cabin, momentarily eclipsing the scraping. The cycle continued, relentless and immutable. The blood rain, the inky fur, the scraping, the pressure. The cabin felt less like a room, and more like a cage, the walls pressing in, the air growing thin. The cat's purr, a low rumble, seemed to vibrate not with comfort, but with an unsettling menace. A profound sense of emptiness settled within me, a void that threatened to consume me entirely. The sound of glass scraping against marble, a dry, insistent rasp, filled the cabin. A heavy weight pressed against my ribs, stealing the air from my lungs. The pattern persisted, an endless loop of decay and distortion. The crimson rain, the inky fur, the scraping, the pressure. The world seemed to unravel, the fabric of reality fraying at the edges. A sense of dread, cold and visceral, coiled in my stomach, tightening with each repetition. The cat's eyes reflected a deep purple light, a malevolent glow that seemed to pierce my very soul. The weight pressing against my chest felt like the crushing weight of the void itself. The present moment blurred, dissolving into a timeless expanse of dread. The silence was deafening, a suffocating blanket that smothered all other sounds. A wave of grief, raw and overwhelming, washed over me, threatening to drown me in despair. The sound of glass shattering, a sharp, brittle crack, echoed through the cabin. The weight pressing against my chest felt like the crushing weight of the present, a relentless, suffocating force. The pattern continued, a relentless, inescapable loop. The mirror's surface was a canvas of crimson, streaks like blood drying on glass, thick and sluggish, as if the very air had been stained by some ancient, forgotten crime. I watched, transfixed, as the red smeared itself across the glass, spreading in slow, deliberate patterns that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The scent of iron and decay clung to the air, thick and cloying, and I could feel it coating the back of my throat, a metallic taste that refused to be washed away. The cat's fur rippled, the matted grey shifting like wet ink spilled across a pane of glass. It moved in strange, deliberate patterns, the fur darkening in places, forming fleeting, grotesque shapes that looked almost like faces, distorted, screaming, mouths open in silent wails. I felt the weight of something pressing against my ribs, a cold, slow pressure that made my breath come in shallow, uneven gasps. It wasn't just the weight of the air, or the heat of the ship, but something else, something that had no name. A sound, sharp and brittle, echoed from the far end of the cabin. It was the sound of glass shattering on marble, a high-pitched crack that sliced through the thick, humid air. I flinched, my body reacting before my mind could catch up, and I felt my chest tighten, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing against my sternum. It was like something was trying to squeeze the life out of me, not with violence, but with a slow, inexorable force that made me want to curl in on myself, to disappear into the walls, to become nothing at all. The cat shifted, its massive body pressing against my shoulder, a weight that was both solid and insubstantial, like the touch of a ghost. I could feel the heat of it, the dampness of its fur, and the way it seemed to ripple with every breath it took. The air was thick with the scent of something burning, something old and rotting, and I could almost hear the faint hiss of smoke curling through the cabin. The mirror's surface darkened further, the crimson streaks now thick and viscous, like tar dripping in slow, deliberate arcs. I could feel my vision blurring, the edges of the room warping and twisting, the walls seeming to press in on me from all sides. The cat's purr, a low, insistent vibration, seemed to come from deep within the ship itself, a sound that resonated through the deck plates, through my bones, through the very air I was trying to breathe. And then, with a final, shattering crack, the mirror shattered, the glass shards clicking against each other like teeth grinding in a silent scream. I felt the weight of grief press against my chest, a crushing, suffocating force that made my breath come in shallow, uneven gasps. I could feel the void pressing in from all sides, the weight of the present, the weight of the future, the weight of everything I had ever been and everything I would never be, and I was alone. The mirror's surface was a canvas of crimson, streaks like blood drying on glass, thick and sluggish, as if the very air had been stained by some ancient, forgotten crime. I watched, transfixed, as the red smeared itself across the glass, spreading in slow, deliberate patterns that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The scent of iron and decay clung to the air, thick and cloying, and I could feel it coating the back of my throat, a metallic taste that refused to be washed away. The cat's fur rippled, the matted grey shifting like wet ink spilled across a pane of glass. It moved in strange, deliberate patterns, the fur darkening in places, forming fleeting, grotesque shapes that looked almost like faces, distorted, screaming, mouths open in silent wails. I felt the weight of something pressing against my ribs, a cold, slow pressure that made my breath come in shallow, uneven gasps. It wasn't just the weight of the air or the heat of the ship, but something else, something that had no name. A sound sharp and brittle echoed from the far end of the cabin. It was the sound of glass shattering on marble, a high-pitched crack that sliced through the thick, humid air. I flinched, my body reacting before my mind could catch up, and I felt my chest tighten, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing against my sternum. It was like something was trying to squeeze the life out of me, not with violence, but with a slow, inexorable force that made me want to curl in on myself, to disappear into the walls, to become nothing at all. The cat shifted, its massive body pressing against my shoulder, a weight that was both solid and insubstantial, like the touch of a ghost. I could feel the heat of it, the dampness of its fur, and the way it seemed to ripple with every breath it took. The air was thick with the scent of something burning, something old and rotting, and I could almost hear the faint hiss of smoke curling through the cabin. The mirror's surface darkened further, the crimson streaks now thick and viscous, like tar, dripping in slow, deliberate arcs. I could feel my vision blurring, the edges of the room warping and twisting, the walls seeming to press in on me from all sides. The cat's purr, a low, insistent vibration, seemed to come from deep within the ship itself, a sound that resonated through the deck plates, through my bones, through the very air I was trying to breathe. And then, with a final, shattering crack, the mirror shattered, the glass shards clicking against each other like teeth grinding in a silent scream. I felt the weight of grief press against my chest, a crushing, suffocating force that made my breath come in shallow, uneven gasps. I could feel the void pressing in from all sides, the weight of the present, the weight of the future, the weight of everything I had ever been and everything I would never be, and I was alone. The sound was a brittle crack, a high-pitched fracturing that seemed to emanate not just from the shattered mirror, but from the very bones in my own skull. It resonated with a peculiar hollowness, a vibration that felt less like sound and more like a physical pressure against my eardrums. The air itself seemed to shimmer, distorting the already unsettling geometry of the cabin. The scent of decay intensified, a cloying sweetness layered over the metallic tang of blood. It clung to the back of my throat, a persistent, almost tangible weight. I could feel the grit of it on my tongue, a strange, earthy bitterness that refused to be swallowed. My limbs felt heavy, leaden, as if submerged in a viscous fluid. The ship, once a vessel of opulent travel, now felt like a mausoleum, its grandeur reduced to a decaying husk. The cat shifted, a ripple of dark fur against my leg. Its weight was unsettling, not merely physical, but possessive. I felt a strange compulsion to look at it, to analyze its posture, its breathing, its eyes. They weren't the usual feline pools of amber or green. They were a flat, bruised purple, like storm clouds gathering over a poisoned sea. The color seemed to bleed into the surrounding shadows, deepening the gloom. My hand instinctively went to my face, tracing the rough texture of my stubble. It felt wrong, not just the length, but the coarseness, the density. I ran my fingers over my jawline, a strange disconnect blooming in my mind. It wasn't my face. It wasn't the face I remembered. A flicker of panic tightened my chest, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The sensation of sand, fine and gritty, shifted beneath my worn shoes. I hadn't been on a beach. I hadn't felt sand in days. The silence that followed the shattering was profound, a vacuum of sound that pressed against my eardrums. It was in that silence that I noticed it 20, a subtle shift in the air, a distortion that wasn't visual, but felt a coldness, a weight, pressing against my ribs, not a physical pressure, but something. Something that breathed. A slow, deliberate inhale and exhale that resonated not in my ears, but deep within my bones. The cat emitted a low rumble, a sound that wasn't a purr, but something more mechanical, more deliberate. It was a ticking, a slow, measured pulse that seemed to synchronize with the breathing I felt against my ribs. It was the sound of a clock, a vast, unseen mechanism counting down to an unknown reckoning. I looked at the cat, and in its eyes I saw not feline intelligence, but a cold, calculating emptiness. My gaze drifted back to the scattered shards of the mirror. Each fragment reflected a distorted version of the cabin, fractured and fragmented. But within those reflections I saw something else. A flicker of movement in the periphery, a shadow that didn't belong. A sense of being watched, not by something 40. The cabin, but something 20 beyond. Something that breathed. The scent of decay intensified, clinging to the air like a shroud. The feeling of sand in my shoes grew stronger, more insistent, a tangible reminder of a place I'd never been. The cat's weight pressed harder against my leg, a silent, possessive claim. I was losing something vital, something essential. I felt it slipping away, dissolving into the oppressive silence, leaving me hollow and adrift. The rain wasn't falling Fionzi the glass. It was Subin it. A viscous, dark crimson pattern, like dried blood blooming across the warped surface. It clung to the interior, refusing to run, distorting the already unsettling view of the endless, silent corridor beyond. The cat, a hulking mass of matted grey fur, sat perched on a nearby chaise lounge, its movements slow, deliberate. The patterns on its fur weren't the usual swirls and stripes. They resembled something unnatural, like ink bleeding across damp parchment. A grotesque mimicry of screaming faces writhed within the fur's texture. A pressure settled on my chest, a weight that wasn't physical but felt like a crushing grief. It stole the air from my lungs, leaving me gasping, disoriented. The sound of glass shattering echoed, not from the broken mirror but from somewhere deeper within the ship, a hollow, resonant crack that vibrated in my bones. It was a sound that promised further destruction, a prelude to something terrible. I tried to move, to push away from the chaise, but my limbs felt heavy, leaden, as if submerged in a thick, viscous fluid. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing against my skin, a suffocating humidity that clung to my throat. The scent of decay, that sickly sweet rot, intensified, mingling with the metallic tang of something ancient and wrong. It clung to the back of my throat, a tangible weight. My gaze drifted to the cat's eyes. They weren't the familiar pools of feline intelligence. They were a bruised, stormy purple, reflecting the unsettling gloom of the ship. The light caught them, highlighting the vertical slits of the pupils, making them seem like predatory windows into an alien consciousness. A low, guttural rumble emanated from the cat, not a purr, but a mechanical ticking, a slow, deliberate pulse that resonated deep within my chest. It was the sound of a clock, a vast, unseen mechanism counting down to an unknown reckoning. The sensation of sand shifted beneath my worn shoes. Fine, gritty, it clung to the soles, a persistent reminder of a place I didn't recognize, a place I'd never been. The memory of the shattered mirror flashed, the distorted reflections, the flicker of movement in the periphery. Something was watching, not from within the ship, but from beyond, a presence that breathed. A slow, deliberate inhale and exhale pressed against my ribs, a chilling weight that resonated not in my ears, but deep within my bones. I tried to speak, to call out, but the sound caught in my throat, a strangled gasp. My voice wasn't mine. It was deeper, rougher, laced with an unfamiliar cadence. A tremor ran through my body, a physical manifestation of the dread that coiled within me. The cat's weight shifted, pressing against my leg, a silent claim. It was as if it were absorbing something from me, leeching away a piece of my being. Panic tightened its grip on my chest, a cold knot forming in my stomach. I reached up, tracing the texture of my face, expecting to find the familiar lines and contours. Instead, my fingers encountered something alien, something rough and unfamiliar. The stubble felt coarse, dense, not the soft, downy growth I knew. My jawline felt wrong, the bones unfamiliar. It wasn't my face. It wasn't the face I remembered. The ticking from the cat grew louder, more insistent, a relentless countdown. The scent of decay intensified, clinging to the air like a shroud. The sand beneath my feet felt coarser, more intrusive. The cat's gaze locked with mine, and in those purple eyes I saw not feline intelligence, but a cold, calculating emptiness. A sense of loss, profound and devastating, washed over me, leaving me adrift in a sea of confusion and fear. I was losing something vital, something essential, something that defined who I was. The rain continued to streak the glass, the crimson patterns spreading, consuming the view, consuming me. The paneled walls of the observation deck exhaled a slow, wet groan as the ship's air thickened into something cloying, a syrup of stagnant heat. The glass before me had ceased to be glass. It was a membrane of congealed scarlet, each crackle of the heat a fresh vein splitting open, weeping that same thick, slow fluid. My fingers hovered over the surface, but the moment I pressed my palm against it, the glass recoiled, slick with the weight of something alive. A shudder ran through my wrist, the sensation of a tongue lapping at my skin. The rain didn't fall. It twinty unfolded, petals of something dark and viscous, clinging to the edges like a wound left to fester. To my left, the cat had shifted again, its massive frame coiled on the chaise, the matted fur now slick with a sheen of moisture that wasn't sweat. It was the same fluid, seeping into the grooves of its flesh. The patterns writhed, not in the fur but through it, as if the ink beneath the skin had learned to move. A face, half-formed, emerged in the fur's texture, eyes too wide, a mouth stretched too thin, lips peeled back in a silent scream. The air tasted of copper, of old coins left in the sun, and I swallowed hard, my throat constricting as if something had taken root there. A crack, sharp and sudden, split the deck, not from the glass, from deeper, where the ship's bones groaned under the weight of something unseen. The sound wasn't a shatter, it was a footy peal, the slow unraveling of something vast and ancient. My shoes, still buried in the phantom sand, shifted as if I'd stepped onto a dune, the grains biting into my soles. I flexed my toes, but the sensation didn't fade. It deepened, the pressure of 1,000 eyes watching from beneath the surface, waiting, the cat's gaze locked onto mine, and for a moment I saw it, not as a beast, but as a mirror. The reflection wasn't mine. It was something taller, broader, its fingers too long, its voice a guttural rasp that wasn't mine either. A tremor ran through my chest, and when I opened my mouth to speak, the sound that came out wasn't air. It was the wet snap of a bone breaking. The glass behind the cat to breathe dived. A slow inhale, the surface rippling like skin, then the exhale, a hiss, a sigh, the sound of something vast and hungry drawing itself closer. The cat's tail twitched once, then again, and from the tip, a single drop of the crimson rain fell. It didn't hit the floor. It hit 3 from B, splattering against my collarbone, warm and thick. I looked down. My skin wasn't mine anymore. The ink was spreading, creeping up my neck like vines, and where it touched, my flesh stung, as if the ink were acid. The cat's eyes. No, I'd sue eyes widened. The pupils dilated, swallowing the color entirely, leaving only the void. A sound then, not from the ship, not from the glass, but from the dark beyond, a wet, tearing click-click, like ice cracking underfoot, like the last breath of something drowning. The weight on my chest wasn't grief. It was the press of a hand pressing down harder until my ribs groaned, until my lungs forgot how to expand. The glass shattered, not in pieces, not in shards. It unzipped, to clean, brutal tear from one end of the pane to the other, the edges curling back like the pages of a book, revealing the dark beyond. The cat's mouth opened, not to me, to the dark, and from the void something answered. A sound like 1,000 teeth scraping glass, like the ship itself was screaming, like the end had finally come. The last thing I saw was my own face reflected in the cat's eyes, not as mine, but as their sea, and it smiled. The blood rain pattern on the glass mimicked the slow, deliberate crawl of something malignant, drying into a grotesque tapestry. The cat's fur, a chaotic swirl of gray, seemed to writhe with the same pattern, the individual strands mimicking the screaming faces I imagined lurking beneath the surface of the glass. A sound, brittle and sharp, echoed glass shattering on marble. It wasn't a crash, but a release, a sigh of surrender. A weight pressed against my chest, a dull, suffocating pressure, not of grief, but of something heavier, something ancient and indifferent. The blood rain pattern on the glass, a morbid mockery of a familiar landscape, continued its slow, agonizing crawl. The cat's fur, a shifting canvas of gray, pulsed with a life that wasn't its own. The strands twisting into shapes I couldn't quite decipher, but felt deep within my bones. The sound of glass scraping against marble was a drawn-out rasp, like the exhalation of a dying beast. A weight settled on my chest, a crushing burden, not of sorrow, but of a vast, unknowable emptiness. Again, the crimson rain bled across the glass, a morbid echo of a forgotten sky. The cat's fur, a tapestry of gray, writhed with a silent, unsettling animation. The individual strands seeming to stretch and contort into fleeting, horrific visages. The sound of glass shattering on marble was not a break, but a peeling away, a layer of reality shedding itself. A weight pressed against my ribs, a crushing force that stole the air from my lungs, a feeling not of sadness, but of being observed by something cold and vast. The blood rain continued its relentless march across the glass, each drop a tiny frozen scream. The cat's fur, a shifting mosaic of gray, seemed to breathe, the patterns within it expanding and contracting with a rhythm that wasn't natural. The sound of glass scraping marble was a prolonged, agonizing sigh, a lament for something lost, or perhaps never possessed. A weight settled on my chest, a crushing burden, not of loss, but of a profound and terrifying solitude. The blood rain clung to the glass, a permanent stain on the world. The cat's fur seemed to flow like ink, the gray blurring into a vortex of unsettling shapes. The sound of glass shattering on marble resonated within my skull, a persistent, throbbing ache. A weight pressed against my present, a suffocating sense of being trapped in a moment I couldn't escape. The crimson rain, a permanent fixture now, distorted the view beyond the glass. The cat's fur seemed to ripple, the gray shifting into a grotesque parody of a smile. The sound of glass shattering on marble was a constant, low hum, vibrating through the floor and up my legs. A weight pressed against my past, a chilling awareness of choices made and paths not taken. The blood rain smeared across the glass, a testament to some unseen horror. The cat's fur pulsed with an unnatural light, the gray shifting into a kaleidoscope of unsettling patterns. The sound of glass shattering on marble echoed in my ears, a relentless reminder of a broken reality. A weight pressed against my silence, a desperate yearning for a voice I could no longer find. The blood rain formed a grotesque mural on the glass, a portrait of despair. The cat's fur writhed with a sickening fluidity, the gray morphing into shapes that defied description. The sound of glass shattering on marble became a chorus, a cacophony of fractured realities. A weight pressed against my grief, a crushing realization that even sorrow had become a commodity. The blood rain dripped, a slow, relentless torment. The cat's fur seemed to melt, the gray dissolving into a pool of shadow. The sound of glass shattering on marble resonated within my bones, a chilling reminder of my own fragility. A weight pressed against my void, a terrifying emptiness that threatened to consume me entirely. The blood rain stained the glass, a permanent reminder of something lost. The cat's fur shifted, the gray patterns coalescing into a single horrifying eye. The sound of glass shattering on marble echoed in my mind, a constant, inescapable torment. A weight pressed against my present, a crushing realization that there was no escape. The blood rain on the glass wasn't falling, it was bleeding into the pane, a permanent scar of dried crimson. Each droplet clung to the surface, not sliding but seeping, like old wounds weeping. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, feeling the heat radiating through the pane. The cat's fur, a tangle of matted grey, rippled as if ink were spreading through it. Strands shifted, forming shapes that weren't there. A flicker of a face, a claw mark before dissolving back into the grey. I could almost smell the wet ink, the metallic tang of old blood. The sound started as a whisper. Not a crash, but the brittle snap of glass meeting stone. A shard sharp as a shard of ice skittered across the marble floor, clicking like a bone underfoot. It wasn't loud, but it echoed in the hollows of my chest, a rhythm I couldn't escape. My ribs felt tight, as if the air had been squeezed out of them. The cat lifted its head, a tiny insect clinging to its muzzle. It ate the insect without hesitation, its jaws closing with a soft, wet crunch. I'd seen this before, the way it devoured the insects crawling from my own wounds, the ones I didn't even notice until they were gone. The cat's fur shifted, the grey patterns flowing like liquid. A face, distorted and screaming, formed in the fur for a second before melting back into the grey. The blood rain continued to crawl, each droplet a tiny frozen scream. The cat's fur pulsed, the grey strands stretching like wet paper. I could hear the sound of glass breaking again, a sharp, brittle snap, but it wasn't coming from the window. It was inside me, the sound of my own bones cracking under the weight. My chest felt like it was being filled with lead. Not grief. Grief was a sharp thing, a knife. This was a slow, suffocating pressure, the kind that makes you wonder if you'll ever breathe again. The cat licked its paw, the grey fur still dripping with the remnants of the insect. It looked up at me, its eyes reflecting the bruised sky blue of the blood rain. I reached for the window, my fingers trembling. The glass was cold, but the blood rain felt warm, sticky. I pressed my palm against it, and for a second, I felt the heat of the sun. It was a lie, but it felt real. The cat padded across the marble floor, its steps silent. It stopped in front of me, its head tilted. I could hear the sound of its purr, a low, rhythmic vibration that felt like it was coming from the floor itself. The sound of glass breaking again, softer this time, like a whisper. I tried to breathe, but the pressure was too much. My lungs burned, not from the weight, but from the heat. The blood rain on the glass seemed to glow, a deep, unnatural red. The cat's fur shifted again, the grey patterns forming a single word, Foiburn. I couldn't move. The weight pressed down, heavier than before. The cat's eyes reflected the word over and over, until I couldn't tell if it was in my head or in the glass. The sound of glass breaking came again, closer this time, not from the window, from inside me.